guns, and money. Send lawyers, guns, and money.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Conduct Detrimental. Alongside myself, Dan Lusk, we have a special guest. Welcome back, Dan Wallach.
Yeah, I feel like this is a reboot of Conduct Detrimental. I've been away for seemingly so long, and I know Taryn and Mike have ably filled in my absence. I've been traveling, and actually this particular podcast, I am in the capital of Siberia, Russia, the capital city of Novosibirsk. So I went through a lot just to get here tonight, and I'll be in Russia for the balance of the month of January. But this issue and this episode was way too important to continue to use Russia as an excuse. So anyway, it's good to be back, Dan, and great to join you as always.
There have been some conspiracy theories, Dan, that you are doing some spy work in Siberia, but I'm not going to make you answer that. Just know that those conspiracy theories are rampant on the internet.
I do not owe my loyalty to Premier Putin.
Not yet.
And it's funny, I've had some access issues where my attempts to sign on to like gambling oriented websites in the US have been blocked by the Russian authorities. So I think I'm being potentially targeted for my espionage activities here in Russia. I think they may be onto me. So I'm definitely in Russian soil, and for the rest of the month. Thankfully, I have my wife here to navigate for me in Siberia, where she's a native and knows the language, and hopefully will get me out of trouble. Or keep me out of trouble.
We will see, Dan. I was dubious that you were in Siberia until I started seeing your tweets with the location turned on. So you are very much in Siberia. So for those that don't know, Dan and I are recording at noon New York time, and that is midnight in Russia. So big shout out to Dan for burning the midnight oil for the podcast. That said, Dan, I appreciate you coming on. This is an issue very much in your wheelhouse that people I know are blowing up your phone to talk to you about this very topic. So we're going to keep this episode pretty tight. I know we promised a recap episode, but we'll keep this mainly to the small tasks at hand, and then we'll take it from there. So obviously, the reason Dan came back for his big, our first episode of 2021, we'll say the developments in the legislation of New York sports betting. The other topic that Dan and I spent a lot of time on, college football. We're heading toward the national championship, so it felt good, like a good time to kind of recap what we haven't touched on the last couple of weeks. And then Dan and I are going to quickly talk about our favorite episodes of 2020, some of our more popular episodes, and then we will send the go home. So Dan, let me turn it to you. Mr. Cuomo has been very busy on the mic recently. I know you've been busy breaking it down. Why don't you give us the lowdown on New York sports betting and all the minutia?
Yeah, when Governor Andrew Cuomo, I said Mario, I had a slip there because Mario Cuomo will feature or loom larger in this overall discussion. But now that Governor Cuomo has moved on from the coronavirus daily briefings, he may still be doing them. He's turned his attention to sports gambling. And in New York State, the issue of sports betting it's been on the front burner with the legislators, but it's been on the back burner with Governor Cuomo. And, in 2-3 years of legislative efforts to bring sports betting, or at least mobile sports betting, to New York, Governor Cuomo has stood firm, and his office has stood firm on the notion that you need to amend the New York Constitution in order to expand sports betting to include remote off-site mobile wagering. And the debate here has focused on Article 1, Section 9's constitutional prohibition against bookmaking, pool selling, and gambling. And, I've argued that there's an exception that applies here for mobile betting through the casino exception under the Constitution. So the state Constitution has an exception for casino gambling at no more than 7 facilities. And it's that exception under which the existing land-based sports betting regime has traveled. And it's always been my position that, and I've backed this up with written testimony and oral testimony in front of the legislature, that the addition of a new distribution channel for an already existing form of gambling isn't expanding gambling or otherwise requiring a constitutional amendment. It's just a different distribution channel. So finally, Governor Cuomo seemingly has moved on from his constitutional objection and now says he's ready to do mobile betting. The problem is that the system or the framework that he's favoring is fraught with constitutional vulnerabilities. For example, instead of operating sports betting the way other states do it, such as New Jersey, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, that utilize a casino licensing model where the state makes money from taxing the revenues of sports betting. Cuomo wants New York to be positioned as, as having a stake in the action and having financial upside associated with sports betting. And he wants to do this in a proprietary fashion where the state is the operator, or at least runs it almost like a lottery and does a revenue share split with a chosen vendor. And, yesterday or 2 days ago, he announced that we're going to go forward and have sports betting operated through the lottery with one vendor selected for the entire state. And for about 1 or 2 hours, that was a lead story until I pointed out that there was a 1984 Attorney General opinion from then State Attorney General Robert Abrams, which put the kibosh on Mario Cuomo's efforts at the time in the early 1980s. Governor Mario Cuomo wanted to operate sports betting through the lottery, and State Attorney General Abrams told him, or issued an advisory opinion concluding that that would violate the New York Constitution, because the state constitution has a specific ban on bookmaking and pool selling, which are synonymous with sports gambling, and you can't fit sports betting into the exception for a lottery when you have specific prohibitions dealing with bookmaking and pool selling. So as a result of that Attorney General's opinion, Mario Cuomo, the father, abandoned efforts to legalize sports betting in New York. And for those who are familiar with PASPA and the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act as to maybe being an impediment to what Mario Cuomo was contemplating in the early 1980s, that law wasn't passed until 1992. So at any point before 1992, any state could have legalized sports wagering without any issues under federal law. So that's kind of where we stand today. And as soon as I raised the lottery issue under the state constitution, Cuomo must be shadow following me on Twitter, or at least his spokesperson and legal advisors are. And he quickly pivoted from having the lottery be the regulator to instead having the New York State Gaming Commission award one license to a qualified mobile operator, conditioned upon the operator having a tie-in with one of the land-based casinos. So he essentially chose the same model, but instead of having it as the lottery, is doing it through the State Gaming Commission, which might pass constitutional muster, but raises a host of other issues as well.
I guess a couple of things. Number one, I'm taking notes, Dan. There's a lot to unpack, but I guess the first one, no need to comment on this, but I think, whether you're very modest about this, you're obviously a leader in the space. And when you say something, obviously people are paying attention. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Cuomo has changed his position after, we'll say, the guru of sports betting, as you have been known, decides to speak. So credit to you on that. It is cool when you or I gets quoted or we make some type of headline somewhere. So this is very much in your wheelhouse. Obviously, you growing up in New York, this is, I'm sure an issue you love covering. The question that I think I know the answer to this, but I'm curious your thoughts. New York, I grew up in New York as well. It's small businesses have been hit hard. The state of New York just generally is taking a very conservative approach to the virus. So there's definitely economic hardship across the state. How much do you think that the pandemic factored into the time frame of Cuomo even having these conversations about sports betting?
I think the pandemic played a major role in the timing of Governor Cuomo's pivot from this is banned by the state constitution to now it's no longer banned by the state constitution, but this is how I want to run it. And I think the pandemic has inflicted, probably more pain on several industries in New York than maybe felt elsewhere. I think the effects of the pandemic the adverse effects impact the entire country. But in New York, the hospitality industry, restaurants and bars, half of them are going to be, closed permanently. And, land-based casinos, not exactly a viable business during a pandemic when you must travel and physically visit a facility and be around hundreds of other people. That's not exactly an optimal situation during a pandemic. And, we don't know how much longer this lasts, but it does underscore the need to be able to have a more remote product, in the way that almost every form of commerce operates, whether it's movies, banking, buying products on Amazon. We're moving an e-commerce. While that might sound like it's the death knell for casinos, it really isn't. because the casinos are the exclusive operator of sports betting in New York State. And any mobile wagering product, in order to be legally compliant with the state constitution, has to be operated through the casinos. Now, the state constitution mandates, or the exception to the ban on gambling, mandates that with respect to casino gambling, the casino gambling has to be at the facility, with the operative word being at. And the way they're going to do this for mobile betting is, as long as the server, now you're a technology guru, as long as the server, if you could explain what a server is, which is basically the nerve center of the computer operation, if the server is located at the casino, well, that's considered betting at the casino, even if the customer is located in Southampton, Long Island. So under that, you could call it a fiction, or you could call it a contract theory of what constitutes a bet. A bet is almost akin to a contract. You have an offer and an acceptance. The bet is an offer, and the acceptance is the processing of the bet at the casino facility through the server. So having mobile wagering in New York State would not adversely impact the casinos. It would actually benefit the casinos greatly by expanding their reach beyond the four walls of their physical brick and mortar property to potentially being able to draw in customers from all over the state by virtue of having online betting platform partners like DraftKings, FanDuel, Bet365, or MGM. So, the solution here, it should really be an easy one, and a mobile environment during a pandemic, I think, is a perfect storm. The problem is that with Cuomo's new, pivot towards a single mobile vendor, think about a state as populous as New York. It's one of the largest states in the country. New Jersey has close to 45 sports betting license holders. In New York, under Cuomo's plan, there will be just a single mobile vendor. That's an awful idea. It not only limits competition and limits consumer choice, but it's going to leave a lot of disgruntled stakeholders, none too happy about that. And when I think of disgruntled stakeholders, I also think that that's synonymous with potential plaintiffs. And the downside risk of Cuomo going a single vendor route for mobile sports wagering is that it raises the likelihood that one of the excluded stakeholders might want to challenge not only the mobile aspect of the law, but might take on the entire law itself, which, while it's been operational for the past year, and New York casinos have operated sports betting in excess of 12 months already, I don't believe that the statutory enactment is on solid legal footing. I think it's more likely than not that it would survive a legal challenge, but there are some real vulnerabilities in the legislature's authorization of sports betting back in 2013. And if you read Attorney General Robert Abrams' advisory opinion from 1984, it really does provide a playbook for potential plaintiffs to challenge the entire New York sports betting law. And were that to happen, it would be devastating to the industry. Think of what it would do to the capital markets, stock prices of DraftKings, Penn National, Flutter. This is something that could have what I would consider to be a dramatic effect on the industry and the public markets. And all because Cuomo is going to create a regime in which there are many stakeholders that are excluded and might resort to a judicial process or a judicial remedy to seek relief. And if I'm the horse racing industry, if I'm NYRA, the New York Racing Association, the Off-Track Betting Corporations, or the horse race tracks, if Governor Cuomo's proposal would be the one to be enacted in law, that means sports betting would be the exclusive repository or the exclusive offering of the casinos and one online sports betting platform, and there would be zero horse racing involvement in sports betting. And that group, to me, would stand as the obvious plaintiff to file a lawsuit seeking to challenge the entire New York sports betting regime. That's the risk.
I've got two questions for you. We're talking obviously about New York, but this conversation, however many states have not legalized sports betting, they're looking to see what occurs in New York. I mean, it's almost a domino effect to a certain extent. They want to see, just like, once upon a time, when New Jersey made sports betting legal, that was a domino, which has kind of led to each subsequent state. So, obviously everyone listening to this podcast, I know we have some international listeners, and obviously in different states, but it's important to keep this in mind. When this conversation comes to your state, you want to have the backdrop. There is an opportunity to write or anything like that. So Dan, You've alluded to it a couple of times. I mean, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but what it seems to that you're saying that we're not going to have, like, right now you'd have your option of any number of sports betting sites to gamble on if you're in a state that allows it. Are you saying that under the proposal that it would only be like a DraftKings, right? It would be just one entity? And do you have any predictions as to what it would be in New York?
Bingo, that's exactly what it would be. New York would be like New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, state lottery had a competitive bidding situation whereupon the state awarded DraftKings the exclusive contract to operate sports betting in New Hampshire. So in New Hampshire,
it's basically a bid, like a silent auction type deal. Like how does that work? So everyone's submitting bids, proposals?
Well, in New Hampshire, it would be, it operated as there were public procurement laws in just about every state that if you want to have a contractual relationship with a state agency or the state in particular, and it's over a certain dollar amount, there are certain competitive bidding laws that have to be followed. New York was going to go down that route if Governor Cuomo had stuck with his lottery idea. But once Daniel Wallach threw cold water on it, it moved from what could have been a competitive bidding RFP situation. And an RFP is a request for proposals, which is basically putting in your bid and being selected, hopefully, as the winning bidder. So it's moving from that to now the New York State Gaming Commission will award a license to, one applicant. So rather than it be competitive bidding, the New York Gaming Commission will make a determination as to the most qualified vendor, which is a very similar situation. But instead of having, I'm not an expert on the New York administrative law, the New York procurement laws, but I think when the lottery does competitive bidding, that's a little bit different than when the State Gaming Commission selects the most suitable vendor based upon, all these criteria that are in the licensing statutes. So it is really a winner take all. And what this would do is drive up, and the reason behind Governor Cuomo's suggestion of having a single operator is that it would allow the state, at least in the short term, to reap the greatest economic benefit possible. Because in most states, the way sports betting works is that it's a casino licensing model where the state derives its revenues from receiving license fees, gaming license fees, and excise taxes on revenues associated with sports betting or casino gambling. So in New Jersey, the state taxes sports betting revenues, and I forget what the number is, but it's around 10, 12%. Governor Cuomo wants the state to have a higher economic upside rather than just tax revenues at 10 to 12%. He's saying, why should the casinos make all the money? The state should make most of the money. And under a single sourced vendor situation where the state awards a license through something that's tantamount to competitive bidding, you're likely to see a company like DraftKings or FanDuel offer as much as 50 to 60% of the revenues to the state for the opportunity to be the exclusive provider in New York State. Hell, if I operated one of these companies, I would go up to 70, 75% in order to have that. In order to control 100% of the market at that level of volume, I think it might be worth the juice might be worth the squeeze. Why I consider this a real dangerous road to travel down is while it may create the economic upside in the short term for the state, it leaves a lot of disgruntled stakeholders that would have potentially an axe to grind and file litigation. And the filing of litigation would potentially jeopardize the entire regime. And if you look at the Abrams AG opinion very closely, you'll understand why. And I know we'll move on, but I want to leave one quote from that opinion. It is axiomatic that an exception to one of the gambling prohibitions must be narrowly construed. And in the case of the New York Constitution, there's a specific ban on bookmaking and pool selling, but the exception for casino gambling is to be narrowly construed by the court. So in order to interpret casino gambling to encompass sports betting, you would have to broadly interpret what is meant by casino gambling. So I think the law could be vulnerable if the governor proceeds down this path and leave some very disappointed stakeholders on the outside looking in that would then turn to the courts. And once you're in court, anything can happen. And I think there's a greater than zero likelihood that a lawsuit challenging the entire
That said, Dan, obviously it's a lot. It's a lot to unpack, but it's an important concept. As I know personally, I'm very obviously interested to see New York move forward in sports betting. So that said, we'll transition to our second topic of the day. That's really, I guess, a recap on what's going on in the college football world. Dan, I haven't had you to break it down. We spent a lot of time over summer figuring out if college football, should be played, was going to be played. And now we're really at the finish line. And as fate would have it, the conference that I know I spent a lot of time diving into on the Big Ten, they're in the national title game. So speaking of sports betting, Dan, I know I mentioned it in a previous podcast, and listen, the records are there. I took Ohio State plus 850 to win the national title game. That was pre-Clemson. So I have faith in Big Ten Nation. Now, Dan, I think you and I didn't speak about this, but, obviously Ohio State took a lot of heat for, we'll say, getting a rule change made around them so they could be in the Big Ten conference game. I didn't necessarily disagree with the rule change. I disagreed with the timing of it. I think everyone kind of knew the writing was on the wall weeks ago. And obviously, when you make that rule change to allow Big Ten, to allow Ohio State into the Big Ten conference game, literally, the week before the game, the optics are unavoidable that you're making an exception for Ohio State. But that said, that exception is kind of important if the conference stands to make millions of dollars with the representative in the college football playoff. So for those that didn't follow, Indiana looked like they had a seat in the conference game. And that's because they had reached that threshold of 6 games. When Michigan, Ohio State's final opponent of the regular season, canceled, they were not at that 6-game threshold, but Big Ten decided to waive that. So anyway, I give you that backdrop. This past week, Indiana, maybe it was probably a week and a half ago at this point, but Indiana decided to not play their bowl game with the Big Ten patches on their jersey. So at least in some sign of an objection toward the conference. And now as we sit here, Dan, we're recording this on Thursday, January 7th. An interesting development has occurred, again, in the conversation of whether we're going to make a rule change to account for kind of a COVID-19 issue. The long and short, Ohio State defeated Clemson. They're playing Alabama in the national title game. That game is supposed to be played on Monday, January 11th. Now, there have been some whispers that there have been some COVID cases within the Ohio State organization and some high-level players. And I know that the college football playoff has reserved January 18th to the extent they need to postpone the game. Again, no official reports, but some rumblings that Ohio State wanted to move the game back, which would, optics are what they are, would be another rule change on Ohio State's benefit. So Dan, let me toss it to you. We're getting close to this finish line. I guess let me ask you this. Did you see the comments from Nick Saban's daughter on the topic?
Yeah, she's got a really interesting social media presence. I don't take this stuff all that seriously. I take my own social media seriously, but I think there's a lot of oversharing on the site, and it's interesting. She quickly removed it, but I didn't really pay more than a second of attention to it.
The tweet, Ohio State is scared to play us, something along those lines. But she had 2-3 comments, and I want to give credit where credit's due. Taryn actually pointed out one. He's a hawk on social media. Taryn actually found that she had been dropping in people's replies as well. So, it's not a good time to be on social media for the wrong reasons. And Dan, obviously we're recording this a day after the, we'll call it the incident on Capitol Hill. So, there's going to be some ugly comments on social media that are going to lead to some additional termination. So, obviously just mind your P's and Q's. If you have something not nice to say on social media, I still don't understand the benefit of why some of these things are said.
Well, I think the Big Ten saga has been the most drawn out, topic in sports law for the last couple of months. So I think I have a little bit of fatigue from it. And you've been really all over that issue. I haven't been. So I kind of let you run with it, and I'll just sit back and listen.
Well, I'll end it with this, and then we'll turn to our favorite episodes of the year. And the last I checked, Buckeyes were a plus 7.5. So I think my Buffalo Bills were plus 7.5 to beat the Colts this weekend. And the Buccaneers, last I checked, were about an 8.5-point favorite over the Washington Redskins. I'm a big fan of teasers, so if you use those 3 games, I think there's some money to be made, Dan. Okay, that said, Dan, I'd asked, we instead of in lieu of a full recap episode, I just wanted to kind of go over our favorite episodes of 2020. Obviously, we have new listeners that come to the show every week. Dan, I have my list. I have my 3 episodes. Have you, are there any episodes that come to mind that you would tell our listeners to go back and listen to?
No, I didn't like any of them, Dan. The truth be told. No. Several stand out, and they're the ones that have guests. Yeah, I'm not trying to suggest that any episode featuring you and me is not one of my favorites, but I really look back to the episode where we had Pat Leonard from the New York Daily News on, along with Darren Heitner, where Pat discussed the DeAndre Baker, the legal issues in the case, and some of the great investigative reporting that Pat did, and of course Darren with the name, image, and likeness issue, and some of the other stuff that he talked about, the trademark stuff around the Washington Redskins. But Pat is somebody I've been following for such a long time. Back when he was covering John Tortorella and the New York Rangers back in 2010, 2011, he has turned into, I think, one of the preeminent football beat writers / columnists. And, I see him as somebody whose star is ascending. And pretty soon you're going to see him in a national website and moving on from the New York Daily News. He's just that good. And we were very fortunate to have him. And his social media or his Twitter profile, what he talks about, he covers a lot of interesting aspects of not only sports but politics as well. And he's one of the go-to Twitter feeds for me. And I thought that episode was sensational. And if it could be at that level every week, I'd be very happy.
For those that again are coming new, that Dan's referring to episode 51 with our dual Darren Heitner, Pat Leonard episode. It was during the Washington football saga. But the DeAndre Baker one is an interesting one. I don't think people on the national radar picked up the nuances of that. But it's an interesting case. It could be, if it was Pat Mahomes, I think people would care more about it. But from the legal angle, there are just so many twists and turns in that case. We broke that down. Dan, as for guests, I think our most popular episode in our era was episode 59. That's where our Big Ten coverage roughly began. That's our episode with Tom Mars, which made headlines in and of itself. So yeah, that's an episode. If you just want to get into the heart of the storm of the Big Ten saga, you hear Dan and I talking about a lot. Tom was, I think Tom is the lead football attorney, college football attorney. So that was a great episode. Tom got into his background as a Walmart chief legal officer. So, as Dan and I go on the speaking circuit, part about being a quote unquote sports lawyer is just being a really good lawyer at the end of the day that happens to be a fan of sports. So Tom has a good background there. And then Dan, my favorite episode we did together. Actually, let me, Dan, do you smell what my favorite episode would be? Do you smell it?
The sort of the insider claims and the less than fair value that was being given by The Rock to extinguish all creditor claims. That one was definitely one of my favorites. Or am I off?
Yes, you smelled that correctly. That was what The Rock was cooking. That's episode 54. I tell people when friends and family ask me, they're like, where should I jump in? I tell them episode 54. That's the XFL episode. So plenty of wrestling references.
And I have to thank you for keeping us on a regular schedule and for developing a deep bench so that on weeks that you or I are not able to show up for the weekly broadcast, we have either Taryn or Mike to be able to ably fill in. And you're like the Iron Man of Conduct Detrimental. You haven't missed an episode since joining me back in the middle of last year. It's I who goes on these long sojourns. So I really appreciate you steadying the ship, and I'm looking forward in the year ahead. And hopefully there'll be some topics that cooperate, that just sort of that are so interesting that we don't even need guests. But I think it's always helpful to have newsmakers and those who cover the industry on to help break things down. And I always enjoy the conversation with people like Pat, Darren, and we've had a really good time with some of our guests and showcasing our great interviewing abilities. But it's also nice to go back and forth and to do a couple of these solo episodes. So I'm looking forward to a big year ahead where there's a lot of law breaking, a lot of detrimental conduct committed by professional and collegiate athletes, and most importantly, a bunch of sports betting laws and court cases that arise out of any and all of those things. And as long as the source material is there, I think these episodes will write themselves.
It's funny, Dan. Everyone at the end of 2020 was wishing for like a nice and calm and relaxing year. And Dan, if I heard you correctly, you just wished for some law breaking and conduct detrimental in 2021, which, Dan, 6 days into 2021, I think you have got your wish.
Yeah, and then some. I'm ready for 2022. It's a year where there's going to be a lot of strife, not only in the capital, but in the courts and in the world of sports, as you have challenges to the NCAA's amateurism model, and the endless cases, over intellectual property rights, or in the case of Zion Williamson, his contractual relationship with his marketing agent, and even some of these sports betting cases could head to the courthouse. I highlighted the New York situation, but I think in Florida and in California, you have two of the big jumbo states that are going to be contemplating legislation around sports betting, and the state constitutions may loom as obstacles. And I think, at least in Florida, there is almost assuredly going to be litigation if the state legislature passes a sports betting law. So I look forward, I'd like to say, in good times and bad, we'll do quite well, but the bad times are the best times if you cover the legal beat.
I like that, and I think that's a good way to end our first episode of 2021. Dan Wallach, as always, is on social media at Wallach Legal. Myself, Dan Lust, at Sports Law Lust. The show, Conduct Detrimental, is at Conduct Detrimental. So we will see you next week. Siberia and internet connection permitting, Dan will be back with us. Dan, anything to add before we finally put this in the books?
No, just if anybody in our audience happens to be in Novosibirsk, Siberia, please, hey, give me a call. I'd love to meet for coffee at some time, if anyone's in the neighborhood. So I throw that out there as an extra benefit for our Siberian audience.
Our booming Siberia audience. Stay warm, Dan. We'll see you next week on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.